What is up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. As you can see, I have a bunch of my spare wheels in the garage today because today is wheel test fit day. We're going to be test fitting some wheels, measuring some suspension components, and seeing what I can do. But all of this stuff is not going to be getting done on the Genesis Coupe today because I just last weekend bought a new daily driver that I want to see if I can get some coilovers or air suspension and figure out potential wheel specs. So all the wheels we have right here are my 22-inch Bazreias right here. These are my 19s off of the Genesis Coupe before I went down to the 18-inch Bazreias. Then these right here are my stock 19s off the Genesis Coupe. So what we're doing today is we're going to be checking wheel clearances, offsets, whether the 22s are too big, if 19s are too small, if we end up bagging this thing and all that stuff. But I have a ton of work that I need to do today in the garage. So without any further ado, let's get this thing out and get the Santa Fe moved in. After what was the most stressful and nerve-wracking vehicle jacking up, putting on jack stands process of my life, I don't know what it was, but apparently jacking up a 6-day-old brand new SUV was not as fun as I thought it was going to be today. But yeah, now that that's over with, we can finally move on to getting some measurements on the suspension. So like I said, last night, it was like 1:30 in the morning. I was talking to this company overseas about their suspension and coilover systems. So now, last night they gave me measurements. You guys aren't gonna be able to read that screen, but basically what they told me is that their rear spring and spring adjuster is roughly about 9.3 inches in overall length. So now I'm gonna go ahead and compare that to the OEM spring. And then they also gave me a measurement for their front struts when they are adjusted as short as possible. So now if my measurements, or if their measurements are correct and I understand what they're trying to tell me on how they measured it, it's gonna be about a 17-inch overall length from the top hat to the bottom mount on the knuckle right there. So without any further ado, because I want to get that done so we can start test fitting wheels, let's jump right into measurements for the car. So we're in the process of doing our very first measurement here, and this is going to be a little bit tricky to see. So now the company, like I said, gave me a measurement from what it sounds like is the top hat to the bottom hole in the knuckle right there. So now they're saying that their strut has a total length of 17 inches when you get this measurement. As you can see, I tucked this up way up there. This is as high as it goes to the top hat, and we have a measurement of right around 24 inches right there. So just based off of their numbers, that should be what I assume is going to be a 7-inch drop. So they're saying only 2 inches of a drop. That's a ginormous discrepancy. So I'm gonna start taking some pictures of all of this, make sure I'm measuring this correctly, and that way we can get back to them and see if their coilovers are going to work. Now with all that being said, I'm gonna do the same thing on the rear shocks. Alrighty guys, so we are at the rear spring right here, and you can see we got a measurement of basically around 11.25 inches to the center of the bottom spring perch. We are up as high as we can go. Now they're saying that this measurement on their spring and spring perch is about 9.3 inches, which is pretty much almost exactly 2 inches from this height. So that seems like they're going pretty accurate with their 2-inch drop. But like I said, just like I did on the front suspension, I'm going to be taking a bunch of pictures here so that way I can make sure the company and I are on the same page on where we're getting our measurements from. But with all that measurement out of the way, it's time for the fun part, start test fitting some wheels. Alrighty, so 22-inch Bazreias are on the car with the tires, and the front looks like it is going to clear everywhere that I was worried about. It does seem to have about a finger's width of clearance all the way around. Now, the front wheel does look like it is sitting flush with the body of the vehicle, but when you figure out that the vehicle is kind of slanted way like that from being jacked up, you do realize that this wheel is way positive cambered out. So once this is under load and then has lowering springs, it should take out some of that positive camber, slightly negative camber up, and it should tuck in ever so slightly. We might need to run a tiny bit of a spacer on the front, but that's perfectly fine. The more clearance, the better. Now the rear seems to be more of the same story, where it looks like it's sitting pretty flush. But then when you stand back and realize that the vehicle, once again, way leaned over, wheel is way positive over like that. But like I said, once you start getting this thing under load and tucking up with the lowering springs or the coilovers, should take out some of that positive camber, and we might once again have to run a tiny spacer in the back. That's fine, because I think the back might actually need a little bit of extra clearance. So it does look like we're really, really close, but I can still get my finger in here. Now where the problem is going to be this fender liner. This is definitely going to contact the tire and the wheel. Same with the one over here. Might be a little bit of clearance right here, but as you get further down, it's a lot tighter. So fender lines might need to get taken out if we do want to run these Bazreias. Next step, I want to get this thing off of the jack stands, get the weight of the vehicle on these wheels and tires, so that way we can see what this thing looks like under load. And then at that point, we can keep going with our measurements for those coilovers. Alrighty guys, so I've been sitting here for probably like 15 to 20 minutes looking at this car, and something wasn't making sense to me. So now if we look at the car right here, these tires on Bazreias are pretty much almost identical to the overall diameter to the tires that are on the OEM wheels. Yet if we take this and we measure the height of the rear arch off the ground, which is 34 3/4, and then we take this and we go over to the driver's side with the OEM wheels still on, you will see what my issue is with this whole thing. Is that this side is now sitting at 33 3/4. So that means that just from jacking this car up to take those wheels off to put those wheels on, because the suspension is so freaking new, that it must have a ginormous gap that it needs to settle down. So whereas this is saying that this has roughly a, let's see, what does this say? A 9 1/4 inch gap. That is really going to be 8 1/4 with a 2 1/2 inch drop, brings that down to 5 3/4 inches, which is going to be roughly about there. Still not low enough, would like it lower, but that's why I'm gonna wait on this manufacturer, see if this company thinks that their coilovers should go a little lower. So if I could get this baby an inch lower, I think I'd be pretty happy with that, just as a temporary setup. Alrighty guys, so I decided to come over here on the driver's side rear wheel and tire, and obviously, as you can see here, this is the OEM wheel and tire. So now what I'm doing over here is trying to figure out if it's even worth it to continue thinking about modifying this vehicle. What I mean by that is, if I even put this thing on air suspension with the correct wheel and tire setup that I would choose, would it ever be low enough to satisfy me, or am I always going to be dissatisfied with how high the vehicle sits off the ground? So now basically where I'm at is the 22s on the passenger side right now would be okay for a temporary setup on coilovers if I could get it low enough. But based off of the measurements and me not hearing back from the company yet, I don't think that that would be a setup that I would be okay with long term. Like I said, it might be okay for 1 or 2 drives or whatever. I said it's just like a temporary setup, but I don't think long term I would be satisfied with it at all. It just would not be low enough to the ground. Now I do think, after seeing the 22s and how well they filled up the wheel arch, that the 19s on air suspension would probably be a little bit too small. This wheel arch is a lot bigger than it seems. I do think the 19s, once it's tucked up there, would just be a little bit too small. So that brings me back to sticking with 20s, just like these OEM wheels. So now it's super easy to figure out kind of how high the car is going to sit off the ground based off of everything that I have here. So now all you have to do is figure out tire sizes that you would choose. So now if I went to a 20-inch aftermarket wheel with air suspension, I would do a 265/35 tire. I could run a 295/30 tire, because a 265/35 and a 295/30 are basically the same thickness of sidewall. There's about a 5 to 7 millimeter difference right there. But anyway, based off of a 265/35 tire, we'll just use that for simple math. That is going to be 3/4 of an inch smaller on each side of the wheel. Meaning that if you took the stock suspension, everything stock right here, and just took this wheel and put a 265/35 tire on it, the center of the hub would end up being 3/4 of an inch lower to the ground. So now with that being said, to figure out the height of the body of the car, if we were to take air suspension and air down basically to fender to lip, all you have to do is take the measurement right here to the side skirts, which is 12 inches. Then you take the measurement from the quarter panel to the top of the wheel, which is 9 inches. Subtract that, which is a 3-inch difference. Then you have the 3/4 of an inch difference in sidewall height for the tire, which would end up giving you a 2 1/4 inch height from the side skirt to the ground, which I think at the end of the day, I would be okay with that because it is an SUV, so it's never going to be as low as, say, my Genesis Coupe or a big body VIP car or anything like that. So I do think that air suspension, 20s, and a 265/35, or even a 295/30 tire, I would honestly choose whichever one had the higher load rating, because like I said, they're going to be very, very minimal difference between overall diameter for the tire between those two sizes. I'd probably choose whatever one had a higher load rating, which I believe a 295 would because it's wired, but I'd have to double check that. I hope that gives you just a quick little glimpse at how I try and figure out this stuff. And like I said, now that I have the vehicle here and in my possession, I could do this a lot easier and a lot more freely. Another thing that I should probably note as well with all of this like height of vehicle thing is that even if I was to figure out a way how to get the side skirts on the ground, the front subframe is actually sitting probably about 2 inches lower than the body of the car is. So even if I could get this side skirt on the ground, the subframe would totally bottom out before and prevent that from happening. So even if I was only to get this side skirt 2 1/4 inches or 2.5 inches like we just went through off the ground, I still think that would be an okay thing because I wouldn't even be able to get the subframe any lower than that. And we're not body dropping or unibody dropping a Santa Fe like you see with all the pickup trucks and the SUVs. But that is something that I just noticed that might actually be a deciding factor on what I want to do with this thing. Because with that being said, I do think that the 20s, the 265/35 or the 295/30 tire and air suspension, this thing would sit low enough to the ground and have a decent enough fitment that I would be happy with it at the end of the day. Alrighty guys, so with all that being said, I think I've talked and rambled and kind of measured and done everything that I can do in this video, and I don't want to make it any longer and sit here jibber jabbering as much as I already am. There's no need for you guys to watch me take off the 22s and put the stock wheels back on, but today honestly was a tiny bit disappointing because I was hoping that these 22s and coilovers would be a cool way to have a nice simple temporary setup to maybe go and get this all done by Gatlinburg in the next few weeks and possibly take it down there. But I do think that just waiting it out and just figuring out an air suspension, I did find a company that says they should have an air suspension system that already fits this car. We are waiting to hear confirmation back from them, as well as I still need to hear back from the coilover company and see what they say about getting this thing as low as I want it. Like I said, if I could probably get this as like a 4-inch drop on 22s, I think I might be happy with that. However, I might run into some clearance issues because these Bazreias do have such big barrels on them and they do have a pretty bad backspacing. But like I said, that's all stuff that we can't really go any further with today. So we're gonna wrap this up. Hope you guys enjoyed me messing around with a brand new 6-day-old Santa Fe. One thing that I did forget to mention here, guys, is that even though the 22s didn't go as I had originally planned, they did give me a nice rough idea on what I need for a wheel spec. So like I said, I did know that those wheels were 22 by 10.5 plus 51. Based off of all the measurements and how those things sit flush to the body, I think all I would really need to do is get a 22 or 20 by 9.5 plus 38. So everything we did today wasn't for nothing because at the end of the day, I did figure out what I needed for rough wheel specs if I did end up bagging this thing. But for real this time, peace out. Catch you on the next one.